I'd like to welcome Sue Bright, who's speaking to us this morning on the challenges nurses face and the impact that has on the patients on the wards.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, what I can do later is send my presentation to one of you so that you can perhaps link the audio with it if someone's very clever. But my initial slide is a picture of me and my nursing set, and I'm afraid that's the only photo I've got. So you're only going to miss text apart from that one. So basically, I wanted to sort of talk a bit about why, if you try and phone one of the wards in one of our hospitals in this area, you might wait ages for the phone to be answered. And if you do speak to a nurse, they may not know who your relative is or too much about them because they are trying to do too many things at once, basically. I must say that these are my observations. It's not a political talk, and I absolutely have no intention of criticising the management where I work because I admire them. They do a great job, I think, in difficult circumstances. And these issues are national ones. I have friends who work in various parts of the country: East Midlands, Cheshire, Herefordshire, Oxfordshire, South West. Everybody describes the same issues, and it's obvious from stuff you can read in the press. So just wanted to say that first. So just a little bit about me. I did my nurse training between 1984 and 1987. It was an apprenticeship style training called traditional training. The School of Nursing was started off called Bristol and Western School of Nursing in 1984. By the time we qualified in 1987, it was called Avon School of Nursing. But the actual school was where the University Hospitals Bristol and Western Foundation Trust headquarters is now, which pretty much hidden by trees. But if you stood facing the Bristol Royal Infirmary, then it's to the far right of that. We in those days we started our training. We did our training in nursing sets, so sort of about 25 people would join a set, and there would be about 5 or 6 a year. So and it was a rolling program. All of us did all the specialties basically, so everybody followed the same pathway. We all started off at Winford Hospital, orthopaedic hospital. Anyone who remembers Winford. We went to then geriatric placements in the Bristol General Hospital or Keynsham Hospital. We did what used to be called psychiatry, but is now called mental health placement. That would have been, gosh, there was a place at the General Hospital that had mental health patients in those days, but also out at Barrow Gurney, which is obviously long closed. We did maternity placements, we did children's placements, we did a bit of everything. And we had a lot of experience on the wards, very little in the community, although some. But then the depth of knowledge was very slim, I think, in those days. Really, it was all about learning through seeing and doing on the wards. Anyway, I had a gap of in total probably about 10 years from working full-time nursing. I did a bit of nursing, and then we had our sailing trip away. I've had a range of experience in Bristol. Sorry, I'm just going to flick on my slides here. Bristol, Plymouth, Banbury, Hereford, and a range of nursing specialties. So trauma and orthopaedics, medical, rehab, cardiology. I've not really followed any career path. I've much more been interested in just learning new things, really. So every time I get a bit bored in the profession, in the area I'm in, I move to a different area. And that's one of the fantastic things about nursing. So I mentioned a little bit about my training. In the 1980s, there were actually two streams of nurse training. There was state enrolled nursing and state registered nursing. State registered nursing was what I did, which was a 3-year program. There were also state enrolled nurses who did a 2-year program. And I think when they set up the scheme, there were certain parts of the job that the state enrolled nurses were not qualified to do. But by the end of the 1980s, that had been phased out. The two roles were almost indistinguishable. And in the 1990s, as a consequence, there was a whole stream of conversion courses, so that state enrolled nurses were able to convert to become registered general nurses, as it was called by then. And then they phased out the state enrolled nurses. In sort of around about the year 2000, there was a scheme called Project 2000, which was the intention of replacing nurse training, the traditional form of nurse training, with training based in polytechnics at the time, universities as they are now. Initially it was diploma level, it's now degree level. So nurses are all registered general nurses or registered nurses are now all trained based in the universities, with placements on the ward. So there are fewer placements and more knowledge. So you might think that they come out with less experience and more knowledge, but actually I do think the quality of the training is much better than it used to be. Interestingly enough, and I think this is the case if you work in any organization or job for long enough, things go full circle. And what's happened recently is, because there aren't enough nurses, they've decided to introduce another pathway into nursing, which is an associate nurse pathway. So an associate, in my view, the associate nurse is the reintroduction of the state enrolled nurse. So a quicker training, therefore getting people in more quickly to actually be able to work as a nurse. Less depth of knowledge and less pay, interestingly, as well. Anyway, we shall see whether that gives us advantages or not. Hopefully it will. There are other pathways as well now. We recently had a student working with us who was doing an open university degree. So a lot of that was based at UE, and she was doing placements like the other student nurses, but able to do most of the study flexibly from home, which was interesting. Anyway, that's a bit about the training. Just a little bit about what nurses earn. So this information is sort of on the screen. So prior to 2004, nurses had their own pay structure, physiotherapists had their own pay structure, occupational therapists had their own pay structure, radiographers, etc., etc. Everybody in the NHS was on different pay schemes. And it was realised that it was actually quite unfair, because junior staff in any grade really they were all professionals by that point, and they should all have been paid the same. So there was a new system of pay came in called Agenda for Change, that came in 2004, which meant that any newly qualified nurse, OT, physio, radiographer was paid the same. And these were bands. So you might hear people talk about band 5, band 6, band 7. So a registered nurse starting out would be a band 5, and you'd be a band 5 regardless. You can go up to your pay would increase incrementally up to 7 years. But I'm a band 5. So basically, if you're working at a certain level without any managerial responsibilities, you're a band 5. And that's really what the job I'm going to talk about today, because those are the nurses on the ward by and large. Just as a point of information, the new associate nurse that they're introducing, band 4, band 5 basic salary is 27,000 to 33,000. New associate nurse, band 4, 24 to 26. So obviously less than the registered nurses are getting now. But there are extra duties. So nurses actually come within the average pay in the UK, which I think at the moment is 28,000. And then we do have extra duty payments paid to us. So any unsocial hours, which is considered after 8 o'clock in the evening, or Saturdays, Sundays, or bank holidays, we can accrue for every hour we work. We might have 30% extra for nights and Saturdays, 60% extra for Sundays and bank holidays. So it's quite possible to top up your pay by working unsocial hours, which is what ward nurses do. And you can choose to a nursing pathway that will give you more pay if you work on the wards than if you work in for example, an outpatient clinic where you don't come across any unsocial hours. We also have a very generous NHS pension with employer contributions of 20.6%, which is really very unusual in public, not in the public sector, but in general these days. So I'm just going to find my next slide. So shift patterns, just a little bit about shift patterns. A full-time week is 37.5 hours a week. Nurses today do long shifts, long days and night shifts. which are basically 12.5 hours long, which includes a 1 hour break, which is unpaid. There can be any combination of those shifts each month. So you might hear nurses talk about off duty. That's our rota basically. And the off duty now it used to be all on paper, and somebody would have the onerous task of working it all out, and you needed quite a mathematical brain to do that. But these days it's all generated on a computer program, with a person sort of going in at the end and making sure it's all covered by the right skill mix, etc. So we can our requests for our next lot of off duty, for example, December is the next lot of off duty that I can make requests for. So between now and then, I know what my off duty is until October. So November and early December is a blank, because the requests for that time are closed. I haven't actually got access to the duties. So it can be, for people who like to know exactly what they're working when for every day of the year, it's not really the job for them possibly. But we can make 5 must-have requests each month. In other words, if you have 5 particular days off, or particular late shifts, long days or night shifts you want to work, you can request those, but no more than that. If you're a patient or a visitor to the wards, you might come across people talking about bank nurses and agency nurses. A bank nurse is a nurse who's employed by the hospital trust, wears the same uniform, and is paid through the salary department of the hospital, but doesn't have a fixed number of hours contract, just has a contract with a flexible contract, just a contract with the hospital. And basically they say when they're available, and the hospital gives them shifts, or they can make requests to work on certain areas and certain shifts. It's incredibly flexible for people with family responsibilities, or some nurses in the hospital work have contracted hours to do 2 shifts a week, say, and then they do a bank shift on for their other shift, and they can choose which shift they work at that time. So it makes it more flexible. Agency nurses you might come across as well. They're nurses that are brought in when we don't have enough staff of our own. Their hourly rate is a lot higher than ours, but they don't have the other benefits, the pension contribution, sick pay, holiday pay that we have. And they may travel long distances actually to travel to work. I'm just going to move on to my next slide. So what does a ward nurse do? So the duties of a ward nurse: takes responsibility for a group of patients. So as a band 5 nurse on a ward, I would have 8 patients, possibly 10, depends on the makeup of the ward. I would actually, one point to note is that if someone goes off sick, or we don't have enough people on the rota anyway, and the hospital isn't able to find a bank or agency nurse to replace that person, then the number of patients on the ward are split between the people remaining. So it may be that you have 10, 12, sometimes even 14 patients to take responsibility from. The job means basically by taking responsibility, we need to make an initial assessment of each patient. And when you're quite experienced, you can stand at the bottom of someone's bed and look at them and think, okay, they're sat on the edge of the bed, they're eating their breakfast, they're talking on their phone to their relative. That's a tick, they're fine, they don't need my input immediately. Whereas you might walk to someone else's bed and you can see that they're struggling to breathe, their oxygen saturation is poor. You need to move straight in and assist them. We always have a handover at the beginning of the shift, and that usually gives you a good idea of which patients are more vulnerable, which ones you need to go and look at first. After we've made our assessment of each patient, a large part of the shift is carrying out aspects of the medical plan, and that may involve quite complex medications that need to be given. It might involve blood tests, helping to arrange patients to go for scans, and any preparation that's done for that, any preparing for operations. And then we need to monitor each patient during the shift. Monitoring might mean looking at them, talking to them, checking how neurologically intact they are. It might mean doing what's called an observation, so blood pressure, pulse, temperature, respirations. ensuring that their, what we call their ADL, their activities of daily living, are carried out. So we need to make sure that they are eating and drinking enough to sustain them, that they are able to move around, to get to the toilet and back, to rest, to take their medications, take part in any investigations that are going on, being clean, etc. Then we need to plan patients' discharges, which involves medications, making sure that their care needs are met at home, liaising with relatives and other healthcare professionals. Okay. Also, there should be a designated nurse in charge of each ward on each shift, and that person would take, sometimes it's a more senior member of staff, sometimes it's a band 5 nurse, but they would liaise with medical staff on the ward rounds, have an oversight of admissions and discharges from the ward, and the close links with the matron, who would be in charge of that, and the bed manager and the clinical site manager, all of whom have responsibilities with bed management. They would need to make sure that the ward is staffed for the next 48 hours. They would need to have input with any sick, particularly sick patients on the ward, and they would have a responsibility for health and safety, for example, if there was a fire or anything like that. Nurses also supervise nursing assistants, students and newly qualified nurses, and that's quite a large part of the role. Obviously, when you start as a qualified nurse, although it's a bit like when you pass your driving test, you qualified, but you're starting your proper learning at that point. So there's a lot, every day there will be questions to be answered and new skills to be learned, which have to be taught. Nurses record all care given and make referrals, and there are often complaints about nurses sort of sitting at the computer or writing, but we're frequently told that unless it's written down, then there's no evidence that we've actually delivered the care that we've done. So if we end up in a court of law as a consequence of something bad that happens, if we haven't written down what we've done, then there's no evidence that we've done it. So that's a really important part of our job. It's very extremely onerous, and often nurses will say that, if only we didn't have to, if only we could spend the time that we spend on the computer and writing, actually caring for the patients, then things would be a lot better. But that is an important thing to do. And all of our referrals that we make are all on different software on the computers now. And the computers are obviously not brand new, because the NHS is not awash with cash, so they're very slow. We spend a lot of time waiting for screens to load. But if we need to refer patients to dietitians, to physiotherapists, to palliative care, to any of those other organisations within the hospital, it all has to be done on the computer. We carry out, apart from the patient tasks that we do, we carry out routine checks and audits, and we report incidents and ensure that equipment's working properly, and report any equipment issues. So there's quite a lot of things to do. So what I wanted to talk about mainly, that sort of bit of background, is that what's really changed in the NHS. And I couldn't really give you a time, from when to when. I think things were better in the early 2000s. I know they were better in the early 2000s than they are now, but it's difficult to actually pinpoint exactly when these things changed. But at the moment, we've had a huge increase in bed occupancy. So if you read health service journals, etc., the ideal sort of bed occupancy is about 80 to 85%. So you've got quite a high bed occupancy, which means number of people in the beds that are available. But you want it quite high, because if you've got lots of empty beds, and that actually was the case in the late 80s, before Margaret Thatcher started closing beds, there were too many empty beds at that time. It could be argued that went too far, but you don't want too many empty beds because it's inefficient, but you don't want bed occupancy greater than 90% like it is now, because you can't then the flow through the hospital is hugely affected. So at the moment, our bed occupancy is greater than 90%, and bed occupancy could never be 100%, because it would literally mean you wouldn't have time to clean the bed in between patients if it was 100%. So you know, that's an impossibility basically. To address this, so basically our empty beds have become full beds. As soon as a patient is discharged, there's another patient's name already allocated to that bed. They may not literally physically be in it, because the bed's got to be cleaned, and then the nurses, wherever that patient is, need to organise the movement of that patient, which obviously takes a short amount of time. We've got extra beds in the hospitals, so any sort of large storerooms that could be converted into ward areas have been converted. We've added, I mean, some of the lovely new sections of our hospital were built with lovely large bays, with lots of room for equipment to move around the beds. But obviously it's been spotted that there's enough room actually to get another bed in those bays. So some of the bays which were designed for 4 beds have now got 5 beds in them. And those are things that are happening all across the whole country. And we now have queues of patients waiting in the emergency department. So it's not just queues in ambulances, the queue is in the ambulance, but once you get into the emergency department, you're then in a queue to be seen, and then you're in a queue if you need to be admitted, a queue waiting for a proper bed in the hospital. Huge problems with flow in the hospital, which is the buzzword for the movement of people through the hospital. So apart from bed occupancy, the acuity of our patients has changed a lot in the last 15 years, I would say. So whereas I can remember when I first started nursing in the mid-1980s, and the people would stay in hospital until they were properly fit and well to go home, or they went to convalescence places. We used to have the fittest patients pushing the tea trolley around, serving cups of tea. I mean, that's absolutely unheard of now. We have very few well patients. Actually, in cardiology, which is where I work at the moment, we do occasionally have well patients, but they're potentially very unwell. They're independent. They can get themselves to the toilet and back. They can eat independently and give themselves a wash independently and all those things. But they're on a cardiac monitor, and the potential for them to have a sudden severe deterioration is high. So they are well, but potentially not. We've got much larger numbers of older patients with much greater care needs than we ever used to. One of the things that is dementia, which is quite a difficult condition to deal with in a hospital. Obviously, the person who comes in with the dementia is going to be completely disorientated by being admitted to an unfamiliar environment, and that will exacerbate any confusion that they have. And it can be very difficult to keep that patient safe and content in the hospital environment, and treat them as well. There's been a huge increase in complex illnesses and what we call comorbidities. So morbidities, obviously, things that can reduce your lifespan, basically. We have people. It's not. Interestingly enough, if you get to your sort of late 80s or your 90s, you sometimes have far fewer comorbidities than people in their 60s who have lived very, very unhealthy lives. We get people. It's very common in cardiology for people to have a whole host of things like type 2 diabetes, COPD, hypertension, high cholesterol. All of these things, risk factors for heart disease, but they impact on each other, and patients have lots of medications and quite complex needs, basically. And there's been an increase in mental illness and drug and alcohol addiction. And those patients often lead very complex and chaotic lives, and are very difficult to sort of fit into a sort of a routine, structured environment like a hospital without having an effect on them and the other patients and staff around them. Staffing issues. So apart from bed occupancy being high, acuity of patients being high, So in effect, a much greater demand on the time that nurses have. At the same time, we now have fewer of us, basically. So every ward, you probably heard in the press, there's, I don't know what the exact figure is, but around about 10,000 vacancies in nursing. And although there are schemes in place to address that, the rate at which people are leaving is such that we're sort of pouring people in one end and it's pouring out the other end. It's like having a very leaky bucket in terms of staffing. So pre-COVID, we already had problems with recruitment. Every ward has vacancies for nurses and nursing assistants, and nursing assistants are quite poorly paid. Unfortunately, they earn less than supermarket staff. And whilst nursing assistants usually love their job and derive a huge satisfaction from looking after people and making a difference to patients, once they get pushed to the point of working so hard that they lose that job satisfaction, then it becomes much more attractive to just go and to leave and go and work in a supermarket. And we're really losing people to supermarkets at the moment. So we don't have enough people. Nurses on the ward tend to be less experienced than they were before. People like me at my age are a real rarity on the wards. A couple of reasons for that. It's exhausting, I think, is one of the reasons. If you work for 12 and a half hours and you barely sit down, it's difficult to keep that. You have to be quite a high degree of fitness, basically, to keep that up. So nurses of my age tend to be working in different areas of nursing where you don't need to have that same intensity as the wards. But what that does mean is that the nurses on the ward tend to be less experienced. The sort of turnover of ward nurses is greater. But because they're less experienced, they need more support from the staff that are there, have been there a bit longer. There's a high burnout and high sickness rates. It's not uncommon for members of staff on wards to be off sick with stress for long periods. And obviously that's awful for them, and it has an impact on the ward because it reduces the number of people available. Excuse me. Many nurses have taken early retirement. There used to be, in our pension scheme, we used to have the ability to retire at 55, which actually seems quite young these days to retire, but so many nurses have retired at 55 or leave for other jobs. So how do the difficult aspects of change, the bed occupancy, higher acuity and the staffing issues, how do they actually affect us sort of on the ground? So bed occupancy, so sort of shoehorning extra beds into an area that's not really designed for that, even if it's spacious, reduces the space for us to use equipment that it was designed for, so hoists, walking aids, etc. It makes it frustrating, basically. So it's frustrating for patients, it's frustrating for nurses. And, if you have all these things are little, but they add up, basically. I think the relentless pace of the turnover of patients in wards, the fact that there's constantly pressure to discharge people as soon as possible, which is fine. We often joke about the fact that it's very hard to get into a hospital in terms of queues, etc. And it's also quite hard to get out. If you've ever been in hospital waiting to be discharged, it can be hours. There's a process that you have to go through, and because all the staff are so busy, it just takes so long to get through each stage of that process. Because we've put beds in rooms that used to be storerooms, and we've converted them into ward areas, those very conveniently placed storerooms, which had our essentials in that we use all the time, like laundry and equipment and things like syringes, etc., have then been moved to the periphery of these ward areas, which means that nurses and nursing assistants are doing a huge amount of extra walking, basically. So whereas you could just open a door and grab a sheet, have to walk all the way down the corridor, grab a sheet and walk back again, which is quite an inefficient use of our time and very tiring. So our steps have increased quite a lot, I think, since we've had these changes. In terms of the acuity of patients, there's a really large increase in the amount of time needed for each individual patient. And when you think about nurses taking responsibility for sort of 8 or 10 patients anyway, a really good example of that was I had this week, actually. It made me think about it. So I had 2 patients, one of whom who was a man in his 40s. He'd come in with a heart condition. He was independent, but had a very, very slow and dangerous heart rhythm. He had 2 medications prescribed for him, which were tablets. I was able to check his identity. Anyone who's been in hospital knows that nurses always ask you what your name and date of birth are, to check that they've got the right prescription for the right patient before they give it you for safety. So I was able to check his identity, give him his medications. He swallowed them straight away. It literally took me less than a minute, probably less than 30 seconds to do that. My other patient was a lady in her late 80s who had had a complex procedure and had 13 medications. Only a few of those were tablets, which she was able to take quite easily. But there was also intravenous injections, and she had an intravenous cannula in her arm that wasn't working, so that needed me to replace it, which was technically quite difficult and time consuming. She had rectal medications, which required me to find another member of staff to help to assist this lady to lie on her side. She had creams that needed to be administered, so that took additional time. And it made me realise how the acuity of the patients, the complexity of patients, basically the time needed just adds up and up and up. For patients like that as well, there was obviously a lot more interventions from allied health professionals, physios, OTs, dietitians, speech and language therapists who deal with swallowing. And all of those interventions that nurses have, we need to talk to that person about the patient, explain what the issues might be, and then we get some feedback from that therapist afterwards, giving us instructions about how we need to help that patient achieve their goal. All of those things are more time consuming. The numbers of referrals will also increase. The complexity of the documentation increases. That's why the acuity of the patients has a huge impact on nursing, basically. We also have an increased need for what we call ECO staffing. ECO meaning enhanced care observation. So you might see ECO 3 or ECO 4 little signs in hospitals when you visit people. It basically means that ECO 1 is somebody who doesn't really, they need their medical attention, but they don't really need nurses to watch them very, very carefully. Someone who's ECO 3, for example, needs somebody to keep an eye on them most of the time. So it may be because they're at risk of falling, they're at risk of pulling out some very important medication, IV medication that they're having, or their NG tube, or maybe aggressive and might injure another patient. But those are extra staff, basically. So in addition to the staff that are already rostered on duty. And if we don't have those people available, then one of the nursing assistants from the shift will need to be with that patient. What I should say is that when nurses are allocated to patients, so on a ward you might be allocated to 8 or 10 patients, you would should have a nursing assistant to help you with those patients. So the nursing assistant will usually take responsibility for doing the observations, helping people have washes, getting to the toilet, helping to eat their meals. But if you have an ECO patient and you don't have anybody to sit with them, then that nursing assistant sits with that patient and you do 2 jobs, basically. So basically we've got not enough staff on shift, more work for fewer people. The managers who have to sort of staff the whole hospital and make sure each area of the hospital is safe basically are obliged to lend or borrow people from different areas. So if your ward is fully staffed for the day, but your patients are deemed to be able to manage with the staffing that you've got, then one member of staff will be sent to work in another area to help them out. that happens on every shift, not for every ward, but on every shift. At some point, there will be somewhere in a hospital, somebody will be moved around. That has quite an effect on morale, and decreases your job satisfaction. Basically, you know your group of patients. You've got to know them. You've got a plan. You're used to working with them. You're used to the speciality that you're working in, and then you're sent to help in a speciality you don't know, a ward you don't know, with patients and staff you don't know, and it can be quite demoralising. But at the end of the day, that has to be done to keep the hospital as safe as possible. The nurse in charge, there's rarely now, well, maybe not rarely, but more often than not, there is no nurse in charge, basically, of a ward who does a separate job to taking patients. So the nurse in charge will normally take patients, be allocated patients for the day because there aren't enough staff. So all those other jobs that the nurse in charge normally does have to be done as well as looking after patients. That makes it quite a difficult job. There's not really enough time for as much supervision, teaching and learning as we would like, which has an impact on students and staff with less experience. So it's all quite gloomy, but I would like to say, I have got a slide here which says what has changed for the better, and I would like to run through some of that. So we have got more modern hospitals. And it's all of you have had different working environments over your lives, and you know that if your working environment is nice, is a nice environment to work in, then it does have an effect on your morale. And it is nice to work in a nice environment, and modern hospitals are good in that way. And we have more space. We should have more space to be able to move our modern equipment around. But access to better equipment, that's hugely different to when I first started nursing. So we nurses no longer lift any patients. The days of when nurses used to be off for months on end with back injuries are long gone, fortunately. They're off with stress instead, but we don't damage our backs by manual handling anymore. We use slide sheets, we use hoists, we're trained to use all those pieces of equipment. I've mentioned before that the education level of nurses is much greater than it was before, much deeper than it was before, and I think that really benefits patients. The use of modern protocols. This has all come through NICE, basically National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence. I might not have that right because it's changed its name several times, but it's always been NICE. The use of, but when I was nursing in the 1980s, basically consultants would decide what sort of care patients would have for certain conditions, and they were very much in control of that. And there was although obviously the idea would be that they would keep up to date on all the latest research, there was, in reality, it was difficult for them to do that because of time, and there was no requirement for them to do that. So we ended up with huge amounts of variation in different in the treatment of patients. And now we have protocols for the delivery of care, so pathways for certain conditions, which I'm sure if you're a GP or you know anybody who's a GP, they will say it's extremely restrictive and difficult for them to work within, and I'm sure that's right. But for nurses on the ward, when we have somebody come in with, for example, diabetic ketoacidosis, we have a complex but clearly prescribed pathway for them that tells us what they need to be prescribed, how often they need their bloods tested, what to do in certain circumstances, and how to get them off an insulin protocol when their diabetic ketoacidosis is resolved. Likewise, NEWS scoring. You may have heard of NEWS. Whenever someone does your observations in hospital, your respiration, your oxygen saturation, temperature, pulse, blood pressure, all of those numbers that we get, and you can see nurses putting them into iPads or iPods these days, those numbers are calculated to give you a score. So if you are fit and well and without any medical problems, you'll be scoring 0 or 1. If you're unwell, then you'll be scoring 3, 5, 7, I think 16 is the most I've ever seen, but that patient was seen on there, very, very rapidly moved to intensive care. And at every level of new score, it tells the score tells nurses what they must do. It's not a choice. Basically, if you score at a certain point, the patient must be escalated, the condition must be escalated to an appropriate, and it tells you exactly which level doctor must be escalated to them and the issue raised with them, and then the doctor must come and see the patient. I think these sort of things have made hospitals much, much safer. I often say to sort of visiting people that if we had the numbers of people that we need with these sort of modern pathways and high quality protocols, we would definitely be the best health system in the world. What else? We've got practice education facilitators. So these are nurses, very experienced nurses who work in a clinical placement, basically, with not just with students. Students have their own scheme, but with newly qualified nurses and more experienced nurses to identify sort of areas of learning for them. That's a really good thing. And I think the other thing that's really noticeable in hospital is the team dynamics between nurses, doctors, and allied health professionals, OTs, physios, etc. Obviously there is a great deal of respect for people who hold very senior positions, but there is no, there is no sort of bowing down before the consultants anymore. Everybody's part of a team. People are respectful of that, and I've found that absolutely fantastic since I've come back to nursing since 2016-17. Everybody has a part to play, and the team spirit is brilliant. I think that's pretty much my talk. I hope you could sort of stay awake. It's difficult when you haven't got something to look at as well.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Sue. I'm not sure that I did stay awake through all of it, I'm sorry. But anyway, we usually have a question session after the talk. So are you happy for that?
Yes, of course, yes.
Yeah. Right. Hattie.
You're muted.
No, she's not.
Oh. I can't hear her. She is.
Oh. No, we're having the same trouble with Hattie that we were having with Sue earlier on.
Oh. Glad it's not just me.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Well, I didn't have a problem staying awake, so I was absolutely riveted, and yes.
Well, hopefully it explains some of your experience that you've had recently.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely did. And I mean, really, I thought my experience with the team spirit, I definitely met that. I thought really it showed. I mean, I have seen a consultant in the last 10 days trotting along the corridor pushing a trolley. Now, I mean, I thought that was, you wouldn't have seen that a few years ago.
No, true.
They were working as a team, and I thought it was great. Issues I have, which are quite minor and which I'm putting together, are not about anything to do with ward. It's more to do with how the ward experience then fits in with the rest of your life. That is where, quite understandably, there are potentially difficulties, and yeah, it's different, and I think maybe a bit of work might be needed, but it could be me.
I think it's very important to feed back your information, and I think communication generally needs to. For some reason, people are very reluctant to write letters to patients as to explaining what really happens in the sense of delays and possible cancellations and postponements. But my view is that patients and relatives would be a lot more understanding of people in the hospital if they knew that there was a possibility of these things happening. People are sent a letter saying you will have your operation on a certain date and time, and then when it doesn't happen for a huge number of factors that can play into that, not surprisingly, they're very frustrated and angry about it. They've arranged their whole lives around this particular event, which to us in hospitals is just one thing in amongst a million other things. But for that person, it's sort of a very, very important event in their lives, and they need to know that the time, the date might get moved or changed or cancelled, or yeah.
No, I mean, I was very satisfied with what I'm going to call the hospital experience, and including the fact that there were delays, but they were explained. I was told about them.
Yeah, that's good. Mm-hmm.
And yes, it was inconvenient, but I did understand why. And anyway, I got there in the end. I will shut up now, but I was really surprised at how good the treatment I got was. I didn't expect it. I didn't expect people to respond so quickly when I was frightened or I didn't know what was happening. So I hit my bell, and there they were, and they were really nice, and I hadn't expected that. So that I would say means that it's been an improvement in how nurses relate to patients, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I will shut up now.
No, that's all right. No, I think in my view, nurses, although it's, we want to be paid enough to live a comfortable life like everybody does, but at the end of the day, what we want to do more than anything is be able to do our jobs to a high standard. And it's the frustration with that is the most difficult thing.
Hattie, I can't hear you, but it's telling me that you're muted.
I think Hattie might have been writing messages, but I can't see all of them.
Hattie sent a message saying, could we hear her?
No.
No, we can't hear you.
But if she could write a question, then I could answer it.
If you write Sue a question, she can answer. Yes, 12 and a half hour shifts were actually introduced. I don't know exactly when, because it happened while we were away. I had that sort of 10-year period when I wasn't working full time, but it was a response to an earlier realization that we didn't have enough staff in hospitals. And previous to that, we had a shorter sort of 9 or 10 hour night shift. And then we had 2 day shifts, an early shift and a late shift. And there was an overlap of probably about 2.5 hours in the afternoon. So the powers that be realised that if they got rid of that overlap in the afternoon and got people to just work 12 hours night and day, or 12 and a half hours night and day, then the number of whole-time equivalents that could be saved would actually, across the hospital, would be massive. So they did that. It was, I don't know whether it was forced through in various trusts or not, but anyway, the norm is now to work the long shifts. But I suppose at the time when they brought that in, the work pressures, the acuity and the bed occupancy was less, and the staffing was boosted as a result of it. But obviously we can't, we're not prepared to work 24 hours a day to get rid of the 2 half-hour overlaps that we have at the beginning and end of our shift. So I don't think they can use that as a tool anymore to improve staffing.
Can you offer advice, Sue, to friends and relatives who want to contact the patient?
Yes, that's a really good question, Mary. I can offer advice. Many of you have tried phoning a ward only to find that the phone rings and rings and rings and rings. And I'm so sorry about that. It's not that we don't want to answer the phone. It's just that we have so much to do. If we answer the phone, we're in the middle of something, for example, putting a cannula in somebody, or taking somebody for a procedure. Often we can't answer the phone. Sometimes when we could, we continue doing what we're doing, because we know if we answer the phone call will almost certainly not be for a patient we're looking after. So first of all, we have to walk the length of the ward to try and find the person, the relevant person. And then we're distracted from what we're doing. Yes, so I do apologise for that. It's far from an ideal situation. But yes, what you can do is you can telephone the patient themselves. So if you have a friend or relative going into hospital, advise them to take their own phone with them if they have a mobile phone, and their charger. The charger is the critical bit, because obviously the phone doesn't keep charged for that long. And you are allowed to plug your phone into any socket in the hospital, and you are allowed to use your phone in hospital. So if you can phone your relative and ask them how they are, and also you could ask them to ring their call bell for their nurse to come, so that you could speak to them on their phone. Most nurses wouldn't have a problem with that at all. The other thing you could do, if you can't phone your patient direct, obviously they might not have a phone, they might be unconscious, for example, they might not be able to speak to you on the phone. But there are certain times of day that are better to phone than others. The period early morning, so from sort of 6:30 until, well, it's not really even early, 6:30 till about 10, I would say, is the absolute busiest time of the day for nurses. So to phone then is going to be very difficult to get through. What you might find is you get through to a ward clerk who could answer your question if it's a straightforward question. But usually if it's an inquiry about a patient, then the ward clerk will have to get the nurse. And what the nurse will say, if she's still doing the drug round, will say, I'm sorry, but I'll have to speak to them later after I've finished what I'm doing. So if you called after 10:30 in the morning, say, and then you avoided the period of time in the evening with the run up to the handover time. So if you, from about 6:30 in the evening to about 8:30 in the evening, is also a very busy period. So my advice would be to try to ring late morning, early afternoon, or phone around 10 o'clock in the evening. I know people might worry that a ringing phone might disturb people who are sleeping, but very often where the phones are is away from the bays where the patients are, and nurses may have more time to answer it at that time. But please don't not call, because phone calls are important to find out. I suppose the other thing I would say is that if you've got a large family and you're inquiring about a patient, please don't do as quite a lot of families do, and every single member of the family phones up to find out how that person is. Delegate one person in the family to make the inquiry and then feed it back to everyone else. That's a simple way of reducing the number of phone calls we need to answer. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. It is very helpful.
So I think Sue had a question. Yeah.
Can I? It's about discharge and aftercare, really.
Yes.
I know you say that
Sue?
we have a lot. I live in. Can you hear me?
Your voice is a bit disjointed. I can hear you, but I can't. Yeah.
Right. I live in a block of flats that's independent living for older people. The number of independent older people we have quite a lot of dementia, which is a real responsibility for residents. And we also have people who are sent home from hospital, I think in the assumption, because there are carers attached to the place, in the assumption that people will automatically get care. And I've had a situation with two people that I've known quite well recently who went into hospital with broken bones, broken legs, and came out with a physio sheet. And I've tried to help them with their physio, but actually on one case, it wasn't possible. And in another case, I didn't have the knowledge and experience to really help her. And I just wondered how much people are aware of what people are going home to, but how much the hospital are aware of what people are going home to when they're discharged. even when you're in a place like mine where you've got care and support, if you need it, you have to pay for it and you have to know to ask for it, and they have to have the time for someone to do it. You know, and it's quite frustrating when you see someone who's quite fit and active break something, come into hospital, come out, and they're wheelchair bound. You know, which.
Well, it's difficult for me to answer that one, really. I think you know, every patient who's admitted to hospital, before they go home, their needs are assessed, but that assessment is based on what the patient tells the occupational therapists, the nurses, the doctors, and sometimes what the family members say as well. But if a patient says that they're independent and they don't need help, and sometimes a self-assessment of your independence is not very accurate, let's say, then they could be sent home, you know, to continue an independent life when in fact they aren't very independent. It's a difficult one to answer. I think you know, there are shortages of staff in every area, basically. Carers in the community, all the different hospital groups of staff. So everybody is working flat out, and I think there will these sorts of situations where people don't have perfect care when they're discharged, is inevitable, really, in a system that's under so much pressure. It's not what we want, but I think it must happen. I can't see how it doesn't happen, really.
So do you still make use of hospital social workers? Because they used to be paramount in this assessment.
Yes, that's a really good question, actually, Mary. I haven't come across a hospital social worker for years, actually.
Do they exist now?
Sorry.
Do they exist now?
I don't know. You're right, though. When I worked in a rehabilitation ward in Banbury, and our social workers were a key part of hospital discharges. I think my experience of discharging patients recently, it's been led mainly by the occupational therapists. I've sort of done an assessment, and then if the patient needs funding for a care package, it goes to a panel. There's some sort of form that you fill in. Again, a computer referral. OT, nurses, doctors have to put input into that. And then it just gets sent off. And then the OT liaises with the patient and their family regarding the care package as a result. So I don't know. Nobody mentions hospital social workers these days, or nobody that I've come in contact with, maybe in other parts of the hospital. So no, it's a bit of a mystery. I don't know whether they do exist or not.
I was a hospital social worker for about 5 years, and we were worked off our feet, not 12 hours a day, but we saw ourselves as a vital sort of smooth link between the one and the other. Yes.
There is a department called the hospital discharge team. Whether they have hospital social workers within them, I don't know, I'm afraid.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, sorry, can't answer that one.
Well, we better all stay fit and out of hospital, hadn't we?
But I think, that Patsy had a positive experience. I mean, I come across patients all the time who are full of praise for the kindness and attention they've had, and they've had a positive experience. So it's certainly not all gloomy.
Is it very demoralising to have bad press and moaning and groaning people in the supermarket queue and things like that?
Well, I think I don't sort of really view it as criticisms of us, because we're all we're working absolutely flat out and doing our very, very best to do the job that we do. So I don't actually really see it as criticisms of us. I think it's the system, really, that's at fault. But the demoralising bit is, like I mentioned before, that you haven't got enough time to do the job you want to do, basically. Time on people.
22,000 paces, you said you did?
Yes.
On a shift?
Yeah. Well, but mind you, the hospital porters, when I speak to them and ask them how many steps they do, it's sort of 1,600 a day. No, 10,000 a day, because I do 10,000 to 13,000 a day, and they do 15 to 16,000 a day. It's got a lot of walking, and it's not cardiovascular exercise unless you're using the stairs when you go up and down. It's just basically wearing out your joints.
Can I say, you haven't talked about the outpatient because you haven't been involved in outpatients, but I have not in hospital for a very long while, but patients I've had some with this year, and it's been brilliant. And I've been dealing mostly with nurse practitioners who really know stuff.
Yeah, so the specialist nurse posts, that, I didn't mention that as what's changed for the better. I should have done, actually. But so sort of large numbers of specialties within the hospital now have nurse specialists within them, and they do all sorts of things, including prescribing. But they have a massive amount of knowledge within their specific area. And unlike the doctors, not consultants, but doctors lower than consultant level, they stay in post for many, many years. So whereas junior doctors, anyone below consultant level, they're constantly training, constantly moving placements and hospitals. Those specialist nurses stay in post for years, and get to know their group of patients intimately and have a massive breadth of knowledge about their subject. Yeah, they're absolutely fantastic invention, if you like.
Right. Well, we've started rather late, and it's now past the time we usually stop. Is there anybody else with any pressing questions or comments they'd like to make to Sue before I thank her and we...
What I can do, Chris, is I can send Patsy or send you, if you send me your email, just the presentation, and then you might be able to somehow link the two.
David might well be able to do it when he gets back.
If I send it, I've got your email address, Patsy, so if I send it to you, and then you can always forward it to him.
I will. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Sue. Thank you very
Really
much.
good. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.